Looks like we have a quorum. So welcome everyone, our guests and commissioners to the Richmond Planning Commission meeting of December 6th, 2023. We have a few studio guests and a couple of Zoom guests. So that's great. We're going to look at the agenda first and make any adjustments.
We have 4 people.
What's that?
4's in the
Hello?
agenda. Never mind.
Okay. You okay, Mark?
No,
We were-
evidently not. A little trouble with my math.
Okay.
Yeah,
We weren't hearing you very well. It was kind of coming and going, but there are 4 of us, so I think we can start. So our first item on the agenda is to review and adjust the agenda. So apart from our basic functions that we have at the beginning of every meeting, our business today is to have a public hearing, as was warned, on the residential uses via the PUD process in the IC district and revisions to the planned unit development procedure. So does anyone want to make any adjustments or changes to that agenda? Hopefully not, since it was a warned item. Not hearing any, we will proceed with the agenda as it was laid out. Any public comment on non-agenda items? Okay, hearing none, we assume our guests are here to speak about or to listen in to the warned item. We'll quickly move to number 4, reviewing the minutes of our 11/20/23 meeting. Did anyone have any comments about those minutes? They've been up for a week or so. All right, not hearing or seeing any comments, we will accept those minutes into the record as written. Okie dokie. So we'll move to number 5 on our agenda, which is the public hearing that I mentioned. And we will need a motion from a commissioner to open the public hearing. So I'll open the floor to that.
I move that we open the public hearing for the proposed changes to the zoning district.
Okay, is there a second?
A second.
Seconded by Adam. And all in favor of opening the public hearing should say aye.
Aye.
Adam? Mark? Joy?
Aye.
And I'm an aye. So the public hearing is opened at about 8 minutes past 7. Okay. So I'm hoping that everyone has had a chance to read the memo that I wrote that kind of outlined a little more completely what we were talking about here.
Tell me which one to fold up.
Yeah, I'd like the map with the 3 different parts of the IC district. Basically, we're proposing to amend section 3.7, which is the industrial commercial district, which we're looking at, or we were looking at in the purple there on the screen. And also to amend section 5.12, which is the planned unit development or PUD section. And we will kind of proceed along the way the memo proceeded, which is mostly in the order that this came to us to do this work. So I wanted to make sure everybody knew what we were talking about first with the industrial commercial district. We'll tackle that piece first, and then we'll get to the PUD part after that. So the light purple up here is the industrial commercial district. It exists in 3 sections. It's right near exit 11. So I'll talk about the two pieces that don't concern us as much first and get them kind of out of the way. There's a small portion on Kenyon Road. That's where the cursor is right now. That's where there's a sand and gravel pit. There are 2 lots that are involved with this part of the IC district. One is part of the Conant Farm, the big farm, number of lots that encompass the Conant Farm on both sides of Route 2. And the smaller part of that is in the Eden Sand and Gravel property. So there's land that's outside of the IC district on both of those properties, but we do not see houses on those properties. One is the farmland, and then the other one is the sand and gravel. So that's that piece of the IC district. The second piece is where the Route 2 number is. It's bounded by Governor Peck and by the highway and by Route 2. And there are 4 properties there. The 2 that where the cursor is, the small one and the big one, all belong to Green Mountain Power. There's a big solar array there, and then there's some kind of a transmitting station or something. Anyway, they're commercial properties. There's the piece that borders Governor Peck is Cleary Stone, and that is a commercial operation. And then the mobile station is the 4th piece of land there, which is in the IC district. That's our mobile station. And then the rest of it all belongs to the highway. It's the park and ride. It belongs to the state of Vermont. The exit ramps and so on is part of that piece of the IC district. So those pieces are not really impacted by what we're going to talk about. But I just wanted to make sure everybody had a full picture of what the IC district was. So we're going to move to the northernmost piece, which is at the top of the screen there. And these are the 8 lots that we're currently concerned with in these changes. So there are 8 lots altogether in that section. 2 of the lots house businesses. That large lot where the cursor is has J. Hutchins and Land Shapes. Those are 2 commercial kind of trucking and, land work businesses. And the one where the cursor is now placed is a storage area for Patterson Fuel. Patterson Fuel, the rest of Patterson Fuel is located in the commercial district, which is the red area, which we're not going to be talking about, is not affected today by what we're doing with the IC changes. So that's 2 lots. 1 additional lot is the recycling area where the cursor is now. And across Rogers Lane from that is the swamp, or whatever you want to call that, wetland. It's a swamp. So that's 4 of the lots, 2 commercial, 1 recycling, 1 swamp. The other 4 remaining lots are residential in nature. That one, where the cursor is going around those, they're on the border with Jericho. The one that looks like a necktie, that's about 10 acres. Then there's the 3 lots, which actually have Rogers Lane addresses there, that are residential in nature. So out of the 8 lots, 4 are residential. So the Planning Commission was approached by a resident of one of these lots who wished to subdivide and put another residential lot there. That seemed reasonable to us because it's a little neighborhood of residential properties. We have a housing crisis. We thought, why not have some more residential use here? However, we didn't want to expose the whole of the J. Hutchins Land Shapes property to residential use because we would like to retain some kind of commercial space. So the method that we eventually, after looking at a number of different methods to allow more residences in this district where residences are currently not apparently allowed. These are all they preceded the zoning. So they're non-conforming residential lots. So we decided to use the PUD, the residential PUD process. So for everyone who's not up on that, that is a section of our zoning that allows you to modify some of the standards of the district where the lot is in order to make the best use of the land. So in this case, to put more residential uses on already residential lots seemed like the best use of the land. So we decided to utilize that process and to make sure that the language of the PUD section and the language of the IC section were in alignment such that the PUD process could be used to put more residences on these residential lots. So the language of the PUD section was ambiguous as to whether that was already okay to do, because in the PUD section 5.12, it said that this district could be used for residential planned unit developments. However, in the language of the IC district itself, it didn't list residential uses as a possible use. So there was already a problem, even before we went here, that those two sections were not really aligned. So the two changes that we needed to make in the language of the IC district were to allow residential uses in residential PUD only.
Is this my dinner?
Mm-hmm.
And the other change that we needed.
In this meeting.
Hello. The other change that we needed to make was we needed to alter the conditional use, which said a PUD could be put in this district as long as there was no subdivision. Well, to us, that made no sense because PUDs are mostly related to subdividing lots. Our PUD language said it could either be a single lot or multiple lots. But in the IC district, it said it could only be a single lot. So that was another inconsistency that we found that was going to make it difficult for us to use the PUD process.
I'm good.
Give me a dollar. Buy
I don't want random.
Five.
I don't want it.
Establish
furniture.
I
These
don't
new
want
red-
it.
Okay, don't know. All right, well, we'll just work through it here. So the two changes that we needed to make to the industrial commercial district were as follows. In the permitted uses, we needed to add dwelling units as part of a residential PUD. And we needed to say in the conditional uses, you can have a residential PUD with or without subdividing the land. Basically remove the restriction that it couldn't be subdivided. So those are in the document. If you see the two amendments that we need to make into the IC district itself to permit us to use this tool. So then we had to go to the PUD section, and that was a little bit like opening a can of worms, not just from this project's point of view, but because of other things about it.
Please do some fucking homework,
What?
because I'm asking you. Don't throw that out.
So if
Please.
anybody out there on the Zoom could mute themselves, if everybody could mute yourself, that would be great, because we're getting some sound here that is making it a little hard to hear.
There's literally not a single piece of homework that I can like.
On the iPad?
Who is Jay? Can we know who Jay is?
That's John Wynn.
Oh, that's
He's
John
good.
Lynn. Okay, he's muted. Everybody's muted. We're getting some sound.
Yeah. Bam.
It was us?
And then
Oh, MMC TV. Okay, very good. All right, that should help. Okay, so we're going to move to the, well, let's first see if anybody has any questions about what we've said so far and about the area that we're talking about and about putting residences on those lots. Does anyone have anything they'd like to say or any comments they'd like to make about that? Does it seem, unreasonable or whatever? It was a compromise between retaining the commercial space and allowing more housing in a place that seemed to us to be reasonable to allow housing. Okay, not hearing any comments about that. Mark has his hand up. Mark.
Hey there. I just wanted to say that I don't know if that was directed towards the public or the commission, but I think this was a excellent compromise of the goals of what we were looking to do. And I not to say that things can evolve and change further, but right now to satisfy the immediate goals of some Richmond residents and still maintain the current zoning as best as possible until we have a broader public input. I think the changes as they've been proposed are excellent. So thank you for the work you guys put in on it.
Yeah, I like to term it targeted.
Yeah.
Exactly, Keith. You in Virginia came up with some excellent language that resolved the very reasonable concern that that was proposed and still allows us some flexibility down the road. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so now we have to move to the PUD section to fix it up and align it properly with the language in the other districts. And one thing that I would like to say is that we early on, as the Planning Commission began to work on the zoning and update the zoning, we determined that we really wanted to try to do one district at a time because it was too difficult, we found in 2012, to do the whole document at the same time. There were too many issues to resolve in too much to read, too much to understand. So we're working district by district. So when we looked at the PUD section, we tried not to change anything as much as possible. There are a few exceptions, but we tried not to change anything that related to other districts that we hadn't yet talked about. So when we come to talking about those districts, then we will also look again at the PUD section and make sure that that is what we want to be saying about that particular district. But for instance, in the PUD section, the main point that we've added is down there in 5.12.2b, which says in the IC district, a residential PUD shall be allowed only on parcels that are already in residential use as of the date of adoption. So that is our key point that we're saying here. We have said that it's okay in the commercial parts of this district to have a commercial PUD or a mixed PUD, which is some commercial and some residential. However, we have said, as you will see as we get through this document, that there's a commercial requirement to a mixed use PUD. There's a floor area requirement, as we have with several of our other districts. For instance, in Jolena Court right now, the PUD is mixed, but the first floor has to be commercial. In the village downtown, the first floor has to be commercial. Jolena Court, the first floor or the basement, and I think the basement floor is allowed to be residential.
Let's walk out. Yes.
It's a walkout basement. So, you know, in the different districts, we've made special requirements for different districts based on the way we want to configure them. What we have right now for the AR district and the HDR district is that you can only have residential PUDs. You can't have commercial PUDs. You can have residential PUDs. However, it may be that when we come to talking about the AR district, which is, you know, will be sometime next year probably, we may determine that there are special parameters that we want to put for that district, just like we're putting this special parameter for the IC district. So while a couple of the requirements of the PUD process are affecting all the districts, most of this remains the language that existed prior to our working on it. So let's see. Some of the issues were minor. We had to reword things to make sense. This district was this section of the zoning, the PUD section of the zoning was ambiguous in places. There needed to be some shalls. You can read the red line copy at your leisure and study how we made the changes. Most of the language that you see that's crossed out, actually, we moved to a different section of this section 5.12, just so that it would flow better. So it would, you know, all of the information about residential PUDs was together. All of the information about commercial PUDs was together. So let's see. So that's the basic strategy about the PUD language. The only change that we feel is a substantial change is the removal of the master development plan language. And I know that people are interested in that, so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And that language occurred in, I think, 5.12.4C VII. It was the last on a long list of standards. Go up a little bit more. Yeah, right there. So CVII says this language that a master development plan for any portion, can't read that from here, but for any portion of the
parcel or lot not proposed for
parcel
land
that is
development.
not proposed for development, and the master development plan shall lay out the future roads and infrastructure.
Keyword conceptually.
Yeah. And so this has been difficult over a number of years to make it give us the information that we need about the future. This is a conceptual plan. There are no parameters to the plan. You can draw it with a piece of chalk on a napkin. You can not review it if you don't want. If you don't have any plans, or if you do have some plans, but you don't know where any of those things are going. There were no parameters. There is no way to assess this master plan. So it has been very difficult to administrate. And as we found out from our experiences with Jolena Court, there's no prohibition about amending it. So it doesn't give people any certainty anyway that they know what's coming, because it's possible to amend it at any point. So we consulted with our town attorney, and he was interested in trying to not give people the expectation that they had understood what is coming in the future. And he was okay with removing this language, only he recommended that we replace it with some language that actually helped to underline what could or couldn't be changed about an amendment. He didn't feel that there was a lot of difference between amending the development plan, the master plan, and then amending the approval that was given, and just amending the approval that was given. So right now it's kind of a two-step thing. If you take Jolena Court for an example, if they don't know really how it's going to play out with what they want to do, they will just come back and amend the master development plan, and then they will amend the approval for the PUD. So amending the approval for the permitted uses is more clean in a way. It gives people the understanding that this is what is permitted now. This is what they're allowed to do. Anything else that the PUD developer wants to do will have to come back for an amendment. And what we have been encouraged to put in is this language that says in the PUD hearing process, the DRB is going to identify anything that is a critical permit condition. And a critical permit condition basically is one that they feel the approval really rests on. And in most cases, according to our town attorney, this has to do with open space. As we can all imagine, this is where the conflict comes in. So this new language that we're putting in here is calling upon the DRB to define any critical permit conditions. In other words, if there's a giant wetland that can't be built on, that needs to be identified as a critical permit condition. And if it is written in as a critical permit condition, it will be difficult to overturn. Now, you can't say that it can never be overturned because the law is not like that. But it has to undergo these this what's called the Stowe Club Highlands Hildebrand test, which is, according to our town attorney, difficult to meet the criteria of this test in order to approve a critical permit condition.
Right, or affect change.
Or affect change.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are some things about a PUD approval that are not necessarily critical permit conditions. If you want to move, a building from here to 10 feet over to one side, or, there are things that would not be identified as critical permit conditions, and those can be amended more readily. They still have to come back for an amendment and to get a new permit and to undergo the whole permitting process, including the hearings. But if something has been, say, open space has been set aside, or forest blocks have been protected, which we'll get to in our discussions of the AR district, any of those kinds of things that are felt to be critical, in other words, the approval wouldn't have gone through if that was not in there, those will be very difficult to be amended. The permit and the approval for the PUD will be very difficult to amend those things. So while there's no master plan, what this does is it basically says, in our zoning, if you have a piece of property that you own and there is space that is not restricted from being developed by natural features, there's no easement, there's no preservation of this land that is set into the deed, you are able to develop, you are able to come back and get an amendment. I think it allows people to understand that this is possible. It is possible for people to develop their private land unless there's something that is forbidding it. And it helps the DRB to understand what is critical about this, what they have been persuaded or whatever to call a critical permit condition. So at least people have the understanding that that is going to be very difficult to change. So to us, it seemed like that was a more realistic expectation rather than having this undefined, unparametered master plan process that was difficult for people to feel that they had any certainty. And our lawyer was particularly concerned that with a master development plan, the developers felt they had a vested interest in something being approved. That was more of his concern than that others would have feel like they had a vested interest in it being like that. And it's not a vested interest because those people still have to come back and get a permit. So it gave people a false sense that there was something that was actually going to happen when it wasn't necessarily going to happen. So this is what we're proposing for the moment. We haven't felt that the master development plan language worked very well. We are hoping that this works better, but obviously it's going to take some time to understand if this is the best way to go. Like I said, when we look at the other districts, we will be able to determine what language we need to put in those districts relative to their PUDs that will help the DRB to understand that those are critical points. So I think I'm going to stop there and take comments. Any commissioners want to say anything at this point? Okay, not seeing any commissioners. Guests, yes.
Actually, I have some more substantive comments I can share, but I just have two quick questions first.
Yes,
Sure,
please,
do you want
please
to come up here and find a mic is up there?
If other people want to speak, I can let them go first, but I just had two quick questions.
Yeah,
about
no,
the
go right ahead.
Critical permit conditions, I guess.
Yes.
In the mind of the planning commission, do you see that as a potential protection against piecemeal development? In terms of a tool that could be used to say a developer was not bringing forward their full plans and there was some concern about that, and then let's say a DRB could put those current conditions to protect things that they felt could be at risk of development later that were not being presented. Does that make sense? Do you see that as a tool that could be used in that way to protect piecemeal development?
Well,
Are you stating retail development?
piecemeal,
Piecemeal.
yeah.
Oh,
So clearly what we have right now doesn't protect from piecemeal development because you can come back and amend your plan and you can then amend your permit. So you can develop in whatever phase you want. Now, if a developer would like to make a full plan and get it all permitted, but put it in phases, that's would probably help them because they wouldn't have to keep coming back and get more permits all the time.
Yeah.
And of course, everybody would know exactly what was going to happen. But what happens is many of these cases, it is not known what any undeveloped land is going to be used for. There's no plan. there isn't a plan. So there is the possibility of piecemeal development, but there's always that possibility. You can make a subdivision, you can have a 10-acre parcel of land and you can subdivide one lot off, but there's no requirement that those folks have a master plan.
Sure.
Because they could maybe next year develop decide they want to put another one of their kids there and make another lot. So there isn't exactly any protection that you can have from piecemeal development.
I guess what I'm trying to envision a scenario where that
Yeah.
critical permit condition would be
Well-
used. Like, for example, like say there's a piece of land that the developer's saying, oh, no, we don't plan to develop that. That's not being developed. And let's say the board was approving that, they could put critical permit conditions, say that has to remain open land, right?
Yes, and the kinds of cases, according to our attorney, that this occurs in is that kind of cases where there is a piece of open land. For instance, in some of our neighboring towns, they have the requirement in PUD in rural areas that a certain amount of land has to be set
Right.
aside, like 50% of the lot. Like, we're going to grant you the flexibility of using the PUD process, put the houses close together in a clustered, but 50% has to be set aside. Now, that would be a critical permit condition, but it has to be written in as a critical permit condition into the DRB decision,
Right.
else it's messy.
Yeah. that makes sense.
So, and those are the ones that, under the criteria of Hildebrand Stowe Club Highlands, you have to meet these stringent requirements to change.
Okay.
And even if you don't meet them, or you can even, the DRB can turn things down anyway, even if they fail the Stowe Highlands test. But it's a stumbling block
Okay.
for developers to oppose critical permit conditions.
Mhm. Okay.
So, and that's like the best we can
Safeguard.
do.
Yeah.
That seems like the best we can do.
Okay.
And it's, at the municipal level, at the small town level, it's virtually impossible to lay out enough criteria that you can prevent any kind of piecemeal
Sure.
development. People
Yeah.
develop, that's the way they develop. And we are hoping that people will come with their whole proposal, if they have one, at first, get it all permitted or thought about or
Hope.
discussed. But that's mostly not what we see. So anyway, so the districts to which this applies right now, there's not a lot of open land.
Hmm.
This is unlikely to be a problem.
Okay.
It's probably going to be in the district where there is more open land.
They are.
And those are the ones that we're going to be looking at in more detail to see if we want to put more criteria about clustering, housing clustering, about preservation of forest blocks. We already do have wetlands rules. They have to be abided by, but
Slopes.
they could also be listed as critical permit conditions to just reinforce the fact that you won't be able to put buildings in the wetlands, for instance.
Okay, so my follow-up question is, if you scroll to the bottom of this document, the changes to the subdivision regulations don't
Yes.
include any critical permit condition language, is that correct?
So, first of all, it's a little bit unclear to us whether the subdivision language as it currently exists, it's unclear to me whether, if you scroll up a little bit further, no, scroll the other way down to the subdivision language. So does this language in this section refer to all subdivisions or just subdivisions that meet the requirements and are approved as PUDs? It was a little bit, it's a little unclear to me whether this involves all subdivisions. I don't know what you think, Keith, but because in most subdivisions, a master plan is not required. Is that correct?
Well, based on the language here, the master plans are usually applied during the PUD process. And you're supposed to use the three-step process of subdivision on the PUD process. So that's sketch, preliminary, final. But as far as the master plan goes, and what I'm reading here, it's really relegated to a PUD.
I have a very different understanding.
I understand.
of
Yeah,
that.
well,
My understanding is there's a subdivision, or this subdivision ordinance is applied to any subdivision, whether they're PUD or not.
right, well, this is,
If it's a PUD that is having a subdivision,
Sure.
but
I'm
not
talking
all
about just-
PUDs need to have subdivisions.
Sure, I'm talking about just subdivision.
Yeah.
well, and
Not-
not all subdivisions are approved as PUDs.
Yep.
This is an interpretive question
Mhm.
that you're asking as to whether that applies to all subdivisions or not. And it's one that we definitely need to clear up with
Yeah.
the
We're aware of
DRB
that.
and our zoning administration department, whether it only applies to subdivisions that are part of a PUD or not,
I've
or it
written
applies
through
to.
all the subdivision regs. I'm honestly a little confused about that there's confusion on that, because this is pretty clear something that applies to all subdivisions, not just PUDs, so.
Well, this is the only place, unless you found some other place in the subdivision regs, that the master plan language occurs.
I can't speak to that. I don't.
Yeah, we're
So-
aware that it needs some tightening up.
We've gone through and this is the only place that it occurs. And in the middle of that paragraph, it starts out talking about subdivisions that are approved as PUDs. And then it continues with the master plan language. So it's unclear if they're still talking about the ones that are approved by as PUDs, or whether they are talking about all subdivisions.
I would beg to differ. I don't think it's unclear at all, but anyway.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So since we don't require of all subdivisions, master plans,
I think you do currently, though, is what I'm saying. I believe.
well, what I'm saying is that we haven't actually,
But I'm saying the regulations say that you're supposed to, so.
yes. So if in fact that is the case, then we could put the critical permit
Mhm.
in the subdivision regulations as well. We could put it in there. If it's in fact the case that all subdivisions require a master plan, that language could be put in here. I
Yeah,
wouldn't be opposed to that. I just,
it's nonsensical that all subdivisions would require a master plan. If you were to subdivide, let's say you're zoning, I don't typically use examples, but let's say it's a 10-acre lot, that's 1 acre zoning, and you do 10 lots, there's no remaining lot. So there's really not a master plan requirement involved in that. It's typically associated with open space. Or if you're phasing too. I mean, there's also the phasing aspect of a PUD. And that's where this approach goes towards the phasing aspect of it is if you get the whole plan or your subdivision approved and the phases are approved, then you're good to go on all those phases over time.
If you choose to go through a phasing.
Right. And that's the purpose of it, but it is a lot by lot situation too. And it's situational. But no, you bring up a great point, and it does need to be clarified.
So I did want to ask, I did have some more comments, but I didn't want to
Sure.
pick up.
Yeah.
Time. If other folks want to comment first, I can come back up. with
okay,
more. Yeah.
sure. Anybody else have anything they want to say? Yeah, do you want to say
I'd like
something?
to add kind of
Sure.
to the last piece. My name is Jason.
Come on up.
Yes, come on up here to the microphone.
Jason Pelletier, Hillview Road.
Yeah.
What just got brought up in there is that there's the regulation and then there's how the regulation has been enacted. And sorry to quote you,
Mhm.
but I believe you said something to the effect of like the master development plan is a non-starter with the DRB. How will the critical permit, what's called in critical
Critical permit conditions.
conditions, how would that be any different? How would, I mean, it just seems like we're giving another tool that can be used at the discretion or not of the decision-making process. It seems like we're not fixing the problem that we have.
Yeah, I guess the first thing I would say is I wouldn't say it's a non-starter. I don't think they said it's a non-starter. It's unwieldy for them to use. I know that they have problems with it. You know, it's written in the regulations as it's written in the regulations. So, I mean, it's to be applied. I mean, it should be. How you go about doing that is up to them and how they're going to do it and so on and so forth. I mean, you're living this in real time at this point too. I think personally, as we go down this, and this is why we're having this public hearing, is to air all this and is to go through all these processes. That this makes it a little more firmer in the decision-making process than what we currently have. It's not conceptual at that point. And that's my biggest concern as an administrator, is the conceptual language of this, because it's not binding. But if they offer something and it's a critical condition, well, that's binding. You know, and any conditions that the DRB puts on an approval, regardless if it's critical or not, is binding. You know, but from a strictly administrative point of view, it's problematic. It's not a non-starter. It's just it's hard to get to the finish line with that, I think, more than anything. The language is subjective. And I'd like to clear it up. I'd like to make it a little bit more, or much more firm in what the process is to go through to do any changes. And then knowing that a developer has a critical permit condition or a critical condition on an approval, they're going to think twice. You know, they have to go back. They have to go through the process. I mean, it's not just a simple amendment to a plan. You have to go through the whole process again with that type of condition on it. So, you know, working through this as we work through this and we tighten it up, you know, I think we're going to get to the point where it's crystal clear what needs to be done if you're going to do any amendments to anything. At this point, it's not binding. You know, if they came in with a piece of paper with crayon on it, that would satisfy the conceptual master plan. That's not what we want. At least I don't. I wouldn't think you folks would want that. You know, I understand where you're going with this from a regulation point of view as it stands. Yeah, but go ahead.
I think it might be helpful though to have some expectations for when these critical conditions should be considered and what could trigger that happening.
Right. Typically, the staff would guide the DRB down that road. That would be the hope. And you know, typically with the open space, which is what the master plan is dealing with, is that remaining lot, if there is a remaining lot, and it can be developed. What does it look like?
Well, and even remaining lot is subject to interpretation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because a remaining lot, if you put anything on it, isn't a remaining lot anymore.
Well, and
but the definitions really, it can end up being whatever it's wanted to be.
Yeah.
So,
welcome to our world and your world as you're living it right now. I get that.
yeah, I understand the difficulty here, but that's what I think needs to be really explored and considered.
So Jason, what exactly do you think the problem is that's not being solved?
Right.
I mean, I've outlined a few pieces, which is that what compels the process, what would compel these disclosures or this discussion, or if there is something critical to be documented as a condition, what would compel that to ever become a condition? Because I don't know that just if a question being raised is going to end up being a condition.
So what would compel who?
The DRB is what you're.
Is that what you're asking? What would compel the DRB?
Well,
because you can't compel people to disclose things that they do not wish to disclose. You can't compel developers, for instance, to disclose their future plans. A, if they don't have any. B, if they do, but they're vague. And C, if they don't wish to disclose them. You can't compel them to do that. And even if they have future plans that they put down on a master plan, if they can amend it at will, what good does it do you to feel that you've compelled them to disclose something if they can come back and change it?
But perhaps that's the issue.
What?
Perhaps that's the issue. I mean, I thought the point of a PUD was that those buying into a PUD were going to be assured of a certain type of development or certain things. That's why you buy into a PUD versus buying a regular lot that's not part of a PUD. So if the developer can change whatever they want to after the fact, that's the problem.
And that's where the critical condition would come in. Because it's a
So-
much higher bar.
Right, but sounds like that's only for open space and wetlands, but like, say you buy into a residential facility,
Mhm.
and they don't disclose that after they sell all 25 lots or however many they have, they're gonna plop a huge commercial building in the middle because they can change and amend. Now they've just lied to all people who just bought lots, which happens all the time.
Well,
Yes.
typically you would have some type of plan that is shared by in equal parts of the owners of that lot.
Not if you don't require any kind of a grand plan.
Well, it's required as part of a subdivision, a homeowners association. You have to show that type of association as a legal document before they'll approve it.
What about the ones that aren't residential?
Well, that's a different story. If you're talking a mixed use development, and there's open land left over with that, then, it depends on the parameters and conditions that are imposed. And it's hard to put everything into a nice little tidy box. I think you know that.
Oh, yeah,
From
no,
someone
it
like
is. I just think, I don't know your situation at all. It just seems like with a planned, it's called a planned unit development. It seems weird that you would not have a plan and that people who buy into it would have no assurance of a plan. So why just isn't subdivision? There's no plan. So that's a planned unit development.
Well, the parcel as a whole is considered the planned unit development, and it depends on how they're divvying up those parcels, which we would call like a condominium parcel. It's just the footprint parcel. And everybody else owns equal portions of the rest of the remaining land. And typically that is deed restricted. So if it's not, then somebody's not doing their homework.
And it's kind of a buyer beware situation. Like if you buy into a planned unit development where there isn't a plan of any kind, then you may want to not buy into it, because it's hard to prevent people from doing with their own land what they want to do with it.
Mhm.
It's very difficult legally to prevent people who say, what is the plan for this unused land? Well, either we're going to make it common land owned by all of the residences, this piece in the middle and that would be a critical permit condition,
Mhm.
is if it's eased, there's some preservation mechanism, and we assume that the development review board would understand that. And if it was, they would either make it a critical permit condition, in which case you might feel better about buying into it, or they would not. And in that case, if there isn't, even if there's a master plan that says they're not going to put something there, they could come back and amend it and put something there. So, I understand your concern, but it's very difficult in practice to make it for sure that nothing is going to happen here.
Yeah, I guess I was just curious about what the difference between subdivision and a planned and a PUD is if there's no plan. That's the part I'm
That's a great
confused
question.
about. So why not just have it, like either have a plan or it's not a PUD.
Well, the PUD allows you some flexibility
Right.
to make the
Because
highest
you have a
investment.
plan.
Yeah.
I thought that was if you agree to this plan,
Mhm.
that's clear and laid out. And we can then amend zoning regulations, because according to the PUD laws, you don't have to actually follow 100% of the town laws. Why would the town say someone a developer no longer has to follow the laws if you're not even gonna get a plan out of it. Why would you ever do it in the first place?
Well, it's to make the best use of the land.
For whom?
Yeah, well. Somebody's gonna have to decide that, but I mean, there's a lot of things in zoning that somebody has to decide.
Right, but you see what I
Is
mean?
this
But
good
if
or
it's
not?
not, if there's no plan, why is it a PUD? That's what I'm not understanding. Like, if there isn't a plan, seems to me, it isn't a PUD.
Mhm. Well, historically, this is the way PUDs have been used in this town, in the zoning of this town, is to not necessarily have a whole plan for the whole lot, but to allow flexibility so that it could be arranged differently.
No,
So
and I think
traditionally, that's
flexibility-
allowed,
Yeah.
it's been allowed, and that's the way the plan has been used, but you know, I take your
Yeah,
point.
but I figure if we're looking at how to improve it, we should look at how to improve it.
So do you have a thought about how you would improve it?
No, I'm just curious, like, if there isn't a plan, I really am confused about, like, if there's no plan, how it is a planned unit development without a plan. That doesn't make any sense.
It's a category, yeah.
I
Yeah,
think that there's a little bit of a misunderstanding about like there is a plan. I mean, obviously there's a set of drawings and a set of a site plan that is approved with the PUD. The distinction we're trying to draw is that that plan legally and necessarily isn't always the end plan. It doesn't mean that the land always has to be undeveloped in any way whatsoever after that. So there is a plan in place. What we're trying to accomplish is that we are going to address the plan as it's presented to the DRB versus trying to tease out long-term plans that may or may not meet the specific requirements that are in place at those times. So if a developer comes with a plan, gets it approved, implements a PUD with common space, that would be a critical permit condition. And then they come back with some other proposal that doesn't address that, doesn't involve that shared common space, and meets the requirements that the DRB is willing to approve. There's no reason we think that they shouldn't be able to do that simply because they didn't disclose that in the first place. However, if they come back and they want to all of a sudden undo that shared common space that they decided to implement as shared common space to allow their density to be more concentrated in the residential portion, then obviously the DRB has leeway to say, no, you're violating the initial intent of the PUD. But I think that we're kind of trying to recognize that the laws and the regulations and the development within the town continually change year to year, decade to decade, generation to generation. And so taking anything from 1 to 10 to 100 acres or units or whatever, and just saying it does not matter what changes, if you didn't disclose that in 2023, you can never change that. I think we're acknowledging that that's not the right path. It would be great if people would disclose their long-term plans, but realistically, I mean, a lot of PUDs come into place, and then many years later, a second phase is proposed, and it has to meet the requirements. And the regulations could have changed. Many market conditions could have changed. Housing conditions could have changed. And so we're just trying to acknowledge that people may or may not have what we would consider the long-term plan over 30 years when they first implement the PUD over the first few years. So I think it's not true that we don't want to require them to disclose their plan. We're simply trying to make it clear that they only need to disclose the plan for what they are specifically trying to get approved. We're not trying to create a situation where they can not disclose things and disclose them later for their benefit. I don't think that that's what this is creating. I don't think the DRB will let that fly. The DRB will see right through that very quickly. And that would be where the critical permit conditions would come into play, where they could preserve that common land, just because that seems to be the most, a residential PUD is the most common. So that's the most common example we use, but they can preserve that. And then that way future DRBs will know that that's a non-negotiable requirement that they can't change. But that doesn't mean that something can't change. So there's, it is a messy situation, but I don't think we're not trying to eliminate the plan. We're just trying to make it clear what that plan needs to be at this moment.
Okay, Mark. Thank you, Adam.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Adam. That was a very clear summation of much of what I wanted to actually say. So, it's easier to understand coming from you, I think, probably than my blather. But the thing I would want to add to that is just that the emphasis of the PUD conceptually has been to enable developments to go forward with development that is not within the zoning regulations. So if you take a look at the housing that's down at the end of Church Street, where that was a PUD, where they basically, the zoning says, okay, you have certain setbacks for each property, and that's what the village zoning defined as acceptable for developing houses. And what they did is they said, okay, well, we're going to take that same lot of land and we're going to adhere to those setbacks on the outside of the development area. But within that development area, we're going to make concessions. We're going to increase density. We're going to reduce setbacks. Everybody buying into that property that's there on Church Street, knows what they're getting into. It's not a 10-foot setback. It's a 5-foot setback from your neighbor. But all of the neighbors who were there already living in that zoning district that said, listen, you have to have a 10-foot setback or 15 from, major property, major primary structure. Those requirements were satisfied. But within that property, there was a lot more flexibility that enabled a lot more houses to go in. I think in the circumstance, in the condition that we're all thinking about, the zoning, basically the development, the PUD, if it was submitted under that, didn't actually have any leniency. Basically, the development going forward is within the zoning requirements for each individual property of the current district zoning requirements. So they're not looking for any leniencies or any additional excess development or taking advantage of the system, which would probably give the town more control over the overall picture. It was just, a large number of homes getting built at one time sort of got pushed into that window of qualification of a PUD, but it's not like they, if somebody were to do the same thing over 30 years or over one building a year or more, several buildings a year, there would be no PUD applied, no PUD characteristics applied to that. So the work plan the language we're looking to take out really doesn't have any value. It just looks pretty, but it doesn't have any teeth because it really, future plan of the site doesn't require that you actually have to say that, like Virginia and Keith and Adam were saying is, you can make that up and just say, oh, I want to put in, the rest of the land is going to be farm field. As far as I know right now, today, when I submit this permit. Now, is there something to creating language that actually has teeth? Yes, it is. What that language is and how it gets implemented, I don't know right now, but I'm certainly interested in it because what we have right now is really, really worthless. Master plan it's a joke. It doesn't have any application because it doesn't have any fortitude to it. Today I'm gonna wear blue jeans tomorrow, but I wake up tomorrow and decide to put on slacks. Well, it's not a master plan. You know what I mean? I can change my mind on the whim, and right now our zoning regulations don't say if you decide to wear jeans tomorrow, you have to wear jeans tomorrow. Just as if you have an idea of what you want to do, you have to tell us. But it doesn't say you have to have an idea of what you want to do with the overall parcel. So I think maybe the next step is to look into that and put some backbone behind it that forces people to hold to something, if not permanently, then at least over some sort of time period. But right now, that master plan is, somebody could come back, do this huge master plan development, PUD, and after it's approved, have an epiphany and say, oh, wait a second, I want to change this and put in 10 more houses. And that's fine, because there's no record of when that decision is made and nothing holding to it. And so if all of a sudden you decide to do something different, you're just doing something different. And our zoning does not address that at all. So taking away the facade of a master plan, which gives people an impression that it must be held to, is misleading to everyone.
Okay,
So
thanks. Yep. Thanks, Mark. Adam.
I just had a quick question. I guess I understand that, having the critical permit language in there and then having not having it be clear in the regulation when that would be implemented and how that would be implemented might be kind of ambiguous. And so I guess it was a question for both guests and for Keith, is would it be, I guess as we've discussed, a PUD often allows you to, bend the rules of the town zoning district. So, have the house, for example, have houses closer together if land is set aside or whatever. And so would it be reasonable to, or advantageous to have language in the regulations or a policy where if the DRB was going to bend a rule, that there would be critical permit language attached to that, or requirements attached to that, stating how that what the change was allowed and what the requirements to allow that were required to be met by the developer or whatever. I assume they would do that anyway. That's the job of the DRB, but to outline that specifically, just so there's no confusion there. Is that?
Yeah, I in my experience, yes, those conditions can be specific to that level. Absolutely. It varies from DRB to DRB. It just does. But we're giving them the tool by which they can apply it. If they apply it, I have no control over that. Virginia doesn't, you don't. The hope is that it gets applied. Keep in mind with PUDs, you still have to meet your density requirements.
Yeah.
That's the governor of everything in land use, is the density requirements. And to be allowed to have that flexibility design is important for a PUD. It just is. And there is, on many cases, open land that's left over, and typically that is put into conservation, especially if it's residential.
So just to clarify, Keith, if someone had a 20 acre lot and they wanted to put 10 houses on it in 1 acre zoning, they could put 10 houses on 2 acres, use 8 acres as common land to satisfy the density. And so that would be, subject to critical
Yes.
permit requirement language and conservation. The other 10 that wasn't required to meet that density could either be subject to that or could be separate, depending on the DRB, the developer, the whole situation there. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would agree it is.
So I'm just trying to draw the distinction between, open and common land, which are one thing as part of a permit requirement, and then undeveloped land, which could be separate, but could not be that land that was originally allocated in the permit as common land. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Those are separate things, is what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think everybody knows when you change something, many times there are unintended consequences that follow. And a lot of times there's a cascade effect, and that's what's happened here. And as we go through this, that waterfall continues to flow at times. And I'll be for full disclosure, I've done many PUDs, but I've never had a critical condition imposed on one, because any condition that's imposed in a decision is critical as far as I'm concerned. But in this case, we're stepping it up a notch. That's what I'm getting out of this. How is that going to be applied? I don't know. You just don't know. You can't see into the future.
And,
So.
you know, Adam, in answer kind of to your question, I would think that if it were a density related, you know, if you had your 10-acre parcel and you put all 10 houses on 2 acres and the other 8 acres was required for your density, the DRB would automatically consider that. I'm not sure that would have to be written in. There might be other things. And when we talk about the AR district, we're definitely going to have to deal with that, because there are, you know, Act 174, we haven't considered preservation of forest blocks. There are other things that are probably going to need to go into the AR district regulations rather than in the PUD, that certain kinds of land need to be set aside. But in terms of the density question, you know, I think the DRB would know that that was obviously needed.
Mm-hmm.
You have to satisfy your density allowance. And, you know, other ordinances that we've looked at are more complicated in terms of the transfer of development rights. And, you know, there are more complicated mechanisms that you can put in place that would trigger being called critical permit conditions. We don't really have many of those in our zoning, and you know, getting there is going to be a time-consuming process, getting to that kind of thing. I mean, right now, what we are going to have a discussion with the DRB about is that kind of thing. What counts as critical permit conditions? Part of it is going to be informed by our town attorney, who is recommending this concept to be considered. So I don't know if you have any other suggestions about what kinds of things could be written into the zoning that would cause the DRB to call something a critical permit condition. It's mostly about open space, apparently, according to the attorney. There could be other things, but.
I guess I would just pose that same question to all our guests. I mean, I've thought about it a lot, and you know, obviously I can anecdotally think of situations, but thinking of a policy that covers all those situations is pretty far beyond my capability at this time in planning work. And so I just, you know, it's unfortunate, but I guess I feel like that's we're counting on the DRB to do their job, which is not unfortunate. It's great. But what we don't, that does mean that there is some ambiguity there. But I think ultimately the PUD process does provide some ambiguity. And that's kind of why it exists, is that the regulations, you know, you can follow the regulations, or you can do the PUD process, and then you're subjecting yourself, you know, to the, not the whims, but the preferences of the DRB and the ambiguity that's associated with that. So I pose the same question to the guests. I mean, obviously they have very valid concerns, and I've thought about it a bunch, and I don't have an answer of how we would, you know, pretty clearly outline what would be critical permit conditions, what would not, and then all that stuff. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. And it, you know, this is a big issue in the law in these cases that I've looked at. And this is why this Stowe Highlands is called the finality versus flexibility test. It's the conflict between finality and flexibility. And these critical permit conditions as an attempt to deal with that, for which there may not be any perfect answer. And they're super complicated. And, you know, the decisions are very long in trying to wrestle with, is this a final decision or is there flexibility here? So it's finality versus flexibility. But yeah, Bradley.
I don't have a great answer to that question, but
yeah,
I just, maybe just to frame the problem is like, if the developer comes forward and says we're doing A.
Yep.
And it's reviewed as A, and
Mhm.
that's done and approved. And then they say, oh, wow, we're gonna do B. That gets reviewed, approved, okay. Now they do C, okay, that gets approved, reviewed.
Mhm.
They do D, right? And now if you look at A, B, C, D all together, those cumulative impacts add up to such that may not have been approved if it was all proposed as one project.
But
Right.
I think that's a misnomer. I mean, I think that the DRB, when revising a PUD, will look at A, B, and C when approving D, will look at A and B when approving C. So I think that it's not accurate to say that the DRB is going to ignore previous PUDs and amendments when approving future stuff. I think that's specifically what we're trying to make clear, is that the master plan, ideally we get A, B, C, and D out there as one package,
Mhm.
but the PUD process allows them to do it separately, and it's incumbent upon the DRB to review that as a total development package. So that's specifically what we want to make clear, is what we don't want to have happen, and we don't think this actually allows for, is that, you know, doing A, B, C, and D separately should not allow more flexibility outside of timing, or maybe financial flexibility for the developer, or just planning flexibility. It shouldn't allow more development flexibility than being honest and upfront about it from the beginning. And we don't think the DRB would have to be much less qualified and in tune with what's going on than they have ever been to allow that to happen. So I mean, the DRB is very good about that, and they will review the entire package every time. But short of just saying that amendments can never be proposed, I mean, we are granting some kind of putting our faith in the DRB to review that every time. And I think as a homeowner or a neighbor or a community member, if you see them not doing that, it should be brought up. And I think they would appreciate that, because they do pride themselves on thorough review.
I think there's two things I would add to that, is that that may be true for PUDs. I don't completely understand the entire process for PUDs, but two things about that. One is that, you know, that doesn't address the possibility of misrepresentations along the way that allowed them to get there, for that each of those steps. It doesn't address that. And it also doesn't address the scenario, again, of coming back to subdivisions that are not PUDs, where this language has been struck, impacting non-PUD subdivisions, right? So any protections that may or may not exist in PUDs don't apply in the changes proposed to the subdivision regulations for non-PUD subdivisions. So.
Yeah, well, we will look into that, but I would also add that it's a little bit part of the same problem that we face with development, period. Like
Yeah.
these, you know, we subdivide this, we allow 4 lots here on a subdivision. They make this much traffic. Then their neighbors who have an entirely separate piece of property put some more houses on their property. That's fine. That's different, but it adds to the traffic. And then Huntington adds more traffic. You know what I mean? So it's all cumulative.
Sure.
And many of these things aren't even related to each other. They're not projects. They're not part of the same project. They're part of different projects, but they all add up. And whose fault is it that we now have a lot of traffic? Well, everybody, right?
But if you had 4 phases to begin with, and you had 4 phases, you just decided not to disclose it, and you went forward, that's a very different scenario than people separately doing it on their own organically, right? I think that's.
Yeah, but I guess we have no way of knowing if people have 4 phases specifically planned
Right.
out, or whether people may have phases in the future when they have more money or time or plans. And so we're just trying to, I don't think that Richmond, I know that the DRB, and I know that the Planning Commission doesn't want to be in the business of policing people's plans. We want to look at the plans as they are presented. And so if someone presents them separately and if they want to hide them with the hope that that zoning regulations change and to be more advantageous to them, then, you know, there's nothing. I mean, I don't know. I don't say if it's like moral or immoral, but that's not illegal. If someone just doesn't know, then that's fine. And we have no way And if you want to propose a way that we would know the difference, but I mean, I don't see how we would ever know the difference between someone who
Yeah,
doesn't
I
have
do
a
think-
plan and someone who hides a plan.
I do think there's some, actually, I have some prepared statements and I can get into a little bit of that in some of the, but it's
Sure.
a good time to go into that or.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let's start smart here.
Anybody else?
No, we just made screen out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you sign in? Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, of course. So I just want to first start by highlighting some of the concerns I have around transparency behind some of these proposed changes. So this, like we talked about, this proposed PUD language change impacts almost every zoning district, which isn't really clear in the public notice for this hearing or in the planning commission agenda items where these changes have been discussed. And nowhere in the public notice, your agenda items, your meeting minutes, or your meeting recordings can I find any reference to these proposals striking the master development plan language from the subdivision regulations. And that lack of transparency is incredibly concerning, and I think it should give every member of this commission pause. Undoubtedly, there are many people who might be interested in these proposed changes who are not here tonight, as they believe the scope to be limited to the industrial commercial district. Those who don't live in the industrial commercial district may be uncertain if it's appropriate for them to just make comments. I'm sure that many people do not realize that you're not only proposing changing our zoning regulations, but also proposing striking the master development plan language from the town's subdivision regulations. So my concern is that removing the master development plan language will enable unscrupulous land developers to conceal their plans, carry out piecemeal development, evade a comprehensive review of their development plans and associated impacts. Land developers will be able to shield the full scope of their plans from review, even when it is blatantly obvious that a land developer has not disclosed the entirety of their plans. These changes will undermine any requirement of a comprehensive review. It will facilitate exploitative land development that steamrolls through Richmond's already limited protections against piecemeal development. Removing the master development plan requirement is not simply a clarification, it's the reversal of a longstanding element of our town's regulations. I agree that this language needs to be changed, but these proposed changes take us in the exact wrong direction. We need a stronger statement to land developers that they must disclose the entirety of their plans. We need a stronger statement to land developers that piecemeal development is not allowed. And we need a stronger statement to land developers that if they attempt to evade a comprehensive review of the proposed project and associated impacts, then there will be consequences. So a stronger master development plan policy would ensure responsible land development and would dissuade dishonest land developers from exploiting our town and our natural resources. It would not slow down development by residents and by reputable land developers. Such a policy would not force a land developer to make a plan that they don't already have, but it would send a signal to land developers that they cannot shield their plans such that the full scope and impacts of their project are only known in retrospect after piecemeal development of the project is completed. So what you've arrived at is simply removing the master development plan language rather than working to create an administratively feasible procedure. There's not been any meaningful discussion of how the master development plan language could be reworded to more strongly state the intent previously established in our regulations, and there's no discussion of what's lost with removing this requirement. I would have liked to have heard discussion about how you could more strongly state that applicants cannot evade a comprehensive review of their proposed project and associated impacts through not disclosing the entirety of their plans. I would have liked to have heard a discussion of how you could update zoning regulations section 5.3.3 to align with 24 VSA 470A and explicitly give the zoning administrator and the DRB the authority to reject an application that misrepresents any material fact. And this is actually an authority that they already have under state law. And I would like to have heard discussion about giving the zoning administrator and the DRB a clear mandate to ask probing questions when there are obvious red flags of misrepresentation. So what I ask is that the Planning Commission pause your proposed removal of the master development plan language and thoroughly consider a more comprehensive package of changes that would uphold rather than remove the intent previously established in our regulations. I do have more in-depth suggestions that I could share on administrative feasible process, but and I think it would be good to bring that to a conversation specifically on this topic for to be considered as its own agenda item by the Planning Commission. So
I think it is in the warning there, isn't it?
Yeah, this is the public warning and it's right
Public
there.
warning.
It's the master development.
I mean, it's
plan.
pretty clearly in the public warning, revisions to the planned unit development procedure. It's right on the
that's like-
agenda.
What's that?
The subdivision changes are not in the public notice.
Entirely different.
We're not proposing any changes to subdivision. We're simply
Oh,
proposing
you
some
are.
minor revisions to the PUD procedure. So there's no subdivisions outside the PUD procedure wouldn't be proposed. And based on the opinions of the town lawyer and Keith, our zoning administrators, the language that you keep, there's a disagreement here. We fully respect that. But based on the interpretation of our administrators and town attorney, that is not necessarily addressing all development. So while it's entirely open to interpretation, that's the interpretation of our board. And so we weren't trying to hide anything. We're just, our interpretation led things to be warned in a way that maybe was not acceptable to you. So I just want to make it clear, we weren't trying to hide anything. Our interpretation was just a little different. So
I want to be clear that I'm not ascribing any intent. I'm saying that somebody who might be interested in this topic would not be aware that this is being discussed, because.
Gotcha. Yeah, I guess that it would be unfortunate if someone didn't miss that. So.
And also, if you look at the public notice, I'm a little confused about the confusion, because there's literally there are two headings within the subdivision regulations that are being proposed to be amended. One struck entirely, and one struck about half of it. In the public hearing, there is no mention of the subdivision regulations, and there is no mention of any subheading, any section within the subdivision regulations, within the public notice.
Well, it does say the master development plan language to be removed.
From PUDs.
Well, does it say from PUD?
It does, yeah. I mean, just look at section headings of that section there. There's no mention of anything outside the zoning regulations that are being changed.
Okay, and where this was discussed, by the way, was at our meeting of the 20th of October, where the Planning Commission, in discussion, decided to remove this language from wherever it was needed to be removed, and approved the documents for warning with that language removed, so we removed the language where it was needed to be removed. And so that's where the new documents came from.
Sure, no, I understand, but there was the word subdivision regulations never came up anywhere in those conversations, right? So it was,
it was from wherever it needed to be removed.
Yeah.
That was the way it was left. So, and it turned out that it needed to be removed also in the subdivision regulations. So.
So that's a concern with
Yeah.
I just
Okay.
don't know if there are folks who would be, there might be people that be interested, again, that wouldn't necessarily be here because they don't realize the full scope of what's being proposed here. And I think, as I highlighted, I think there's I think a really important piece of this is the misrepresentation part, right? There already is state law on this piece, that if there is a misrepresentation, an application can be denied. So in the scenario where a developer is presenting A, then B, then C, then D, if there are inconsistencies or misrepresentations throughout those processes, that is something where under state law,
Right.
that could be mirrored in our zoning regulation, right? Where that could be more clearly stated, and we can mirror those state laws to make it clear
That you can't misrepresent things.
Yeah, I fully agree on that. I think that if someone's trying to push things through misrepresentation in that way, and even if it's a series of smaller misrepresentations, which I think will be advantageous, then we should 100% try to prevent that. I guess I don't know how do we word. I'm unsure how we word that to make it clear that the DRB is it's incumbent upon them to do that. I mean, I believe that they already know it's part of their job is to specifically try to weed out small incremental misrepresentations that would lead to an approval that may not meet the intent. It's just my concern that if we specifically spell it out that we might be making, we don't, I guess what we don't want to do, or I personally don't want to do, is make the DRB be the police of this. I think that they need to be looking for those misrepresentations, but that's not their primary job. Their primary job is to look at the overall proposal and see if that is in line with what they think is reasonable. And so I just don't want it. It would be unfortunate if they feel the need to, instead of having a lawyer or an administrator review everything, that each DRB member felt the need to review each proposal for the specific wording of every aspect, simply so that they can say that they've caught every misrepresentation. So I agree that we should prevent that, but I just don't know how we do that without making the DRB, each individual member, need to review everything specifically word for word.
Well, we do have a
In a way.
misrepresentation section in our zoning that came up about visual representations. It came up in terms of Jolena Fort, that the visual representations didn't represent what either happened. I mean, I'd have to look through it, but we might be able to beef up that section. It's a section specifically about misrepresentation in our zoning in terms of visual images, but you know, it could be misrepresentation in terms of speaking as well.
If I can, may I respond to that, Adam, the comments you just.
Yeah, go, of course, please.
So I'm not necessarily looking for the DRB to be constantly vigilant, looking for every little thing that could be of concern. It's really a scenario where there are things in front of them that are blatantly obvious, right? And people being brought to their attention. And is it clear that they should be doing something in that situation, right? And you know, the thing I often hear is we can only look at what's in front of us. Well, I read 24 VSA 4470A, and I don't. I'm not a lawyer. I don't necessarily can't necessarily say that my interpretation of that is correct, but it certainly seems to me that under state law they already have the authority to say, you know, if this is inconsistent with this, even if it's not what's in front of us, we can reject that because that's a misrepresentation. And I think making that clear in our zoning regulations would be valuable to make that clear that if there's a blatantly obvious misrepresentation, that you know something has been presented that's inconsistent, you know, that they're not the police, they don't have to go look out for every scenario like that. But if that's in front of them and obvious, then they can do something about it.
That makes that's
Mark,
much more clear. Thank you, Bradley.
Oh, do you want to say something else, Adam, about that? No, okay, Mark?
You're on mute, Mark.
You're muted. Muted. We were glad you were
right there.
I couldn't read your lips. Sorry, Mark.
Yeah, no swearing.
I hope you didn't. Now, Bradley, first I wanted to say thank you for bringing this up, because I do think that it's a real hole in our regulations as they stand. Because like I was trying to make the point earlier, is right now our regulations are toothless. What we say about the master plan doesn't hold any weight and can be changed freely in a PUD or just in a regular development, as long as you don't predefine and maintain the current zoning regulations. There is no regulatory oversight on the town level to hold a developer to future work. I think you would agree with that. So what we need to do is come up with a way of putting some teeth into our language right now. And the way I approach this and this change that we're proposing is that it really doesn't mean anything anyways. So let's take it out, and then its absence may well prompt some real action that can correct things. Because right now, what's there has no value. it gives the appearance of value, and somebody might read the regulations like, oh, well, you got to submit a master plan. So of course things are going to be, monitored and regulated going forward. But, we clearly know that's not the case. There isn't anything there past that point of a theoretical master plan that can be changed on the whim that will give the town any control over what's really getting done, particularly on these larger parcels. And they're fewer and fewer, but it certainly is a concern. So I don't know if you have and the depth of the investigation of what you and folks have been looking into, like concrete language that says, oh, what if we said this in our zoning regulations, as opposed to, because right now I'm leaning towards, let's pop it out because it's worthless and it's a false flag of confidence, and let's realize the fact that we don't have anything, and then let's put something in that's real. Now we're trying to move this forward really as part and parcel of a more specific zoning adjustment that will allow development in an area that of more houses where there's already houses, still not lowering the density level beyond what's already there, but so there's no PUD or anything involved in what we're doing. But as we're reviewing this, we come to the determination that our language as it's written really isn't of any value. So I guess to be more succinct, I would say, is there anything that you've got, are there things that you have that you would recommend to replace what we say now with something that would be more concrete? First of all, I'd like to just move forward with what we have so that we can get this one issue addressed. But I do agree that we need a bigger picture change to our approach to this master plan concept for development in Richmond. And what we need is, we need ideas, we need language that has some teeth to it. So I'm asking you if what you might have for insight that could be more specific.
So I think the first thing I'd say is that I generally, like I said, I generally agree with this idea that revisiting the master development plan language makes sense. I would disagree with you on a few elements of what you shared, but we don't need to get into that right here. I think by and large, I agree that needs to be looked at. So what I would really caution this commission though on is that if you simply remove this language without replacing it with a more comprehensive package, what you're doing is changing the intent of the zoning regulations. You are saying we no longer have this requirement. This is no longer required. This is not something developers need to be concerned with, right? So even if you 100% agree that what's there is problematic and needs to be changed, simply removing it, I don't think is the right step, because it changes the intent of the town zoning regulations, which I don't think the intent of the master development plan should be changed. I think looking at the language, looking at specifically around it, what can be changed makes sense, but I don't think the underlying intent should be changed, and the removal effectively changes your intent.
Well, we are basically replacing it with the other language, with the critical permit conditions language.
So in the case of PUDs, okay, I see that argument. I'm not sure if I 100% agree, but I see what you're saying. But again, coming back to subdivisions, where subdivisions separate that are not PUDs, that is not the case at all, right?
Yeah, so we could add it to the subdivision regulations.
And so I think certainly the critical permit conditions are one good step. But again, like I said, I think to answer Mark's question too, I think, like I said, aligning with state law in terms of misrepresentations, allowing DRB and zoning administrator to look more broadly, to say we're not just going to have blinders on and only look at what's in front of us. Like if there is a misrepresentation, inconsistency, we can look beyond that. I think is one thing. And like I said, giving the intent, I don't have specific wording for you, right? I don't know exactly what that wording would look like, but again, I think clearly stating the intent that we don't want someone, like I said before, to do A, come back, do B, come back, do C, come back to D, when they knew they were doing A, B, and C, D all along, right? That's the problem. And that's should be a misrepresentation, right? Or there likely would be misrepresentations along the way to accomplish that, right? So I think that's one key area to look at. But again, beyond that, I don't have specifics right in front of me at the moment. But yeah. But like I said, I would caution against just ripping it out and going from there. I think you have to if you're going to remove it, you have to do that along with a more comprehensive change. So.
Mark, what did you think of the critical permit conditions language that we're proposing to add?
I'm not sure that really covers everything. To Bradley's point, I mean, because it still doesn't hold to being irrefutable. You know, what we have now is nice, but I'm not sure it holds developers to what we really think they should be held to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we'll have to talk more with our attorney because I believe he's going to say that it's not possible to totally prevent more development on a piece of land. I mean,
no, it can't.
all
but
of his case
it's
law.
to, like, hold people to something more determinative, which is tough because, you know, what we're dealing with in this situation is, you know, the development of half the parcel, all within, you know, the district zoning requirements individually. But then the concern is, you know, they're doing this just to circumvent regulations, and there's no way for us to confirm that that's what they're doing. So the suspicion is there, but there is nothing, you know, but it doesn't mean anything because there's no way to prove it nor to hold to what's there, what's being proposed. And so it is misleading to you know, maybe not necessarily the individual property owners who are going to be buying property within that area that's now become available for development, you know, these parceled off lots, but to the pre-existing neighborhood, there is, you know, I think to a degree they have to have a stronger voice in our regulations that doesn't exist now. And don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-development by any means, but if you're going to do it, then do it and say it and be held to that. But to not do it, and that it's a very sticky wicket to try and define. But I very much get Bradley's and the other folks who voiced concerns tonight point of view, and I don't know the answer, which is why I was hoping maybe
Yeah, I don't
Bradley,
already made
some folks
Sure.
have some better insight.
Okay, great. Joy, did you have anything that you wanted to add to the conversation or any of our Zoom guests?
I don't have any comments, Virginia.
Okay, great, thanks. Anybody else want to make any comments? Okay, so what we're looking for here is to either continue this hearing if we think we need more public input, or to close the public hearing, and then we, as a commission, will take the information that we have heard at the public hearing, along with our attorney's remarks, and Any other things that we wish to discuss concerning this? We will take that and finalize the proposal to go to the select board. So I'm looking for a motion either to close the public hearing if we don't have any other guests here in the room, to close the public hearing or to continue the public hearing.
Is it possible to move forward with only part of the proposed language? You know, the subdivision language for the commercial industrial district. Can we move that forward tonight? Or does it really need to go all at once at this point?
I think what we need to do is either close the public hearing or continue the public hearing. If we close the public hearing, the planning commission is free to do whatever we want with the information that we've gained. We can recreate the proposal in any shape that we want to recreate it in.
Before we
So-
move it up to the select board.
Correct.
Before we approve it for transmittal to the select board for their public process. Yep. There's no time limit. We're able to take this information and do what we wish with it.
Well, if there isn't any other public comment at this point, I would move that we close the public hearing portion and continue the conversation.
Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second.
Seconded by Adam. All right, so the motion on the table is to close the public hearing. Hearing what comments have been brought before us by the public and move to the discussion phase. So all in favor, I'll call on you and you can state your vote to that motion. Adam,
Aye.
Mark,
Aye.
Joy,
Aye.
and I am aye as well. So the motion passes to close the public hearing. And we will be discussing this at our next meeting.
Yep.
So the information that we've received today and hopefully at that point, we will be able to approve a document that we will transmit to the select board.
Virginia, can I make one quick point? Just want to,
Sure.
obviously, I think Bradley, it's not clear. Closing the public hearing is only closing the warrant public hearing. That's not the end of public input. So if you want
Correct.
to join us at our next meeting, obviously you can
people
continue
can
to have
come
input then.
Yeah.
It's not, it doesn't mean that you can no longer have input. Make that very
Right.
clear.
And the select board can also direct us to change things too,
Yep.
so.
And then when it moves to the select board's public process, they will also have a public hearing to which information can be submitted. So, yes, thank you, Adam, for clarifying that. So, okie dokie.
All right.
So I think we're good unless anyone has any final comments. I'll accept a motion to adjourn.
But we're adjourning early. This is freaky. I don't know what to do.
I'll make the motion to adjourn. Before you get that changed.
Well,
Right,
Chris is
Brian,
not
way to
here.
step up.
Chris is not here to make this motion. So Joy, you're it.
I'll second.
Adam, good second. All right. So is there anyone who's opposed to closing the adjourning this meeting? Is there anyone opposed to adjourning the meeting? You should speak now. No one is opposed. So the adjournment passes and we're adjourned and we will see you all. Thank you for coming
Yep,
on
you.
the 20th. Is that right? Yes,
20th.
on the 20th of December.